And welcome to RT's No BS podcast. Today, focusing on the issue of coronavirus. So much that has been discussed in the media. It seems like we talk about coronavirus in one way or another every single day. It is maybe the most impactful thing happening in the world for the last year. And certainly, even though a lot of people had hoped by this time things would have been wrapped up with the coronavirus, that things would be more under control, it feels as if things are less under control than they've ever been. That we're seeing now a talk of more lockdowns on their way, more economic shutdowns coming, and of course, discussion over whether or not mask mandates will follow going all the way into 2021, maybe all the way through 2021. And then, of course, the big question, the question of what do we do about the vaccine that's on its way from multiple big pharma companies that are developing this in multiple nations. It's been developed. The question, of course, will you take the vaccine? Will you even have a choice? We're going to talk about all these issues today in a format that you probably have not seen before. Over the next 90 minutes, we're bringing in a whole series of guests looking at this from a variety of angles. I am Ben Swann and glad to be with you during this time. I want to just begin by telling you something that I was speaking to a friend just last night, and that friend shared with me that in thinking about the coronavirus, they said, I don't know what to believe about anything anymore because I don't know that I can trust media. And so one of the things we want to do today is try to clear up and bring clarity from our guests about what is happening around the world and what will continue to happen over the next few months. So let's bring in our first two guests, and we'll be transitioning in and out of guests throughout this 90 minutes. We want to begin with economist David Blanchflower and Professor Dmitry Kulish of SKoltech. Thank you both for being here. I want to bring you both into this. And let's start, David, with the economy, because it really is on everyone's mind. It's something that so many people are concerned about. Obviously, so many people concerned about what is ultimately going to happen over the next few months and going into next year around the world in terms of the economy here in the U.S. and around the world. So one of the things that we have seen in the past is this discussion of economic shutdowns and lockdowns. Has it been successful? Will we see it again? What say you?
Well, I think the initial shutdowns do appear to have had an effect, but I think the reality is when you look at things like what happens to economies, authorities just didn't really have the courage to do enough. And it's not as if we haven't been here before. I have in front of me the great book by John Barry on the great influenza. His conclusion in that is one thing: the authorities should tell the truth. And I think that's not what's happened. So we have a lack of trust. People, especially in America, people are just not listening to what the government says. And they're obviously fearful. So what we're seeing is this enormous spread with Thanksgiving coming. People don't trust what's happening, and they probably don't trust whether to take this vaccine or not. So what's happened is a sort of virus crisis has become an economic crisis.
Well, it certainly is an economic crisis. And of course, there's a lot of talk right now here in the U.S., certainly, of new lockdowns being instituted. Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York just said, last week, that gyms and indoor restaurants will likely be shut down. You've also heard all the calls for, these Thanksgiving celebrations here in the U.S. Don't have people over, no more than 10 people, no singing, no speaking loudly. Justin Trudeau made a comment just this weekend about Christmas, saying that Christmas as usual will not go on in Canada. I mean, as we look into the next few months, are politicians losing the confidence of people who say, we gave you the benefit of the doubt in the beginning, but we don't give you that benefit anymore because we feel like the what you have imposed upon us is not helpful. It's actually hurtful in many ways.
Well, I think in some sense, that in a way that's not true. The places where shutdowns occur and lockdowns occur and simple things like wearing masks have actually worked. It's unbelievable that the President of the United States has made it clear that not wearing masks is fine, and that's killed people. So obviously the leadership has been a major problem. Believe the science. So I think what we've seen is this move against believing the science. And in the United States, where is it that the virus is spreading like crazy? Answer: in Republican states that listen to Trump, North Dakota, South Dakota, and other places in the Midwest. So the reality, the rub hits the road.
But isn't it spreading? Let me just challenge you on that. Isn't it spreading also in New York right now and in California, where they've instituted very strict lockdowns?
Well, obviously, the thing has been spreading, but the reason to try and do something like wear masks, limit spacing, don't have restaurants and so on. I mean, the answer is, what are you going to do? I mean, okay, you're going to say that. What are you going to do? Just do nothing and let this thing explode? So the answer is no. I mean, the concern is that the economies have to shut down if you lock down, but there's various things you can do. But I don't take the premise that there's nothing that you can do. It's basically people aren't listening. I live in Florida, and Florida is a disaster, as are other places. And why is that? Restaurants are open, bars are open, nightclubs are open, and people are traveling. Aren't there? 1 million people traveled yesterday across the United States. So this virus is exploding because basically the president of the United States has been completely inane about it, and it's killed people.
So one more question for you, and we'll bring Dmitry in. But when you say, I don't think anyone's advocating doing nothing, but when we talk about the cost of what's happening, what about those who say, well, there's a cost in terms of suicide rates are rising. There's a cost in terms of domestic violence that's rising. There's a cost in terms of those issues.
There's absolutely no evidence to sustain that, to actually argue that suicide rates are rising. I mean, essentially the numbers might be in the 10s and the 20s. I mean, we have 250,000 people in the United States. I'm not an expert. I'm an economist. But that's probably one of the most asinine arguments I've probably ever heard. 8 people die from suicide compared to 2,000 people a day dying from this terrible virus. I mean, I just think those arguments are asinine.
Okay, we're going to come back to the discussions about the economy in a minute, but I want to bring Professor Dmitry into this. And Dmitry, let me ask you this. In terms of the vaccine, because we keep hearing over and over that once there is a vaccine, right, that things in theory would go back to normal. At least that's what's been said for almost a year. Now that we're close, and it seems like we are pretty close to having a number of these different companies. AstraZeneca says that they have a vaccine 70% efficacy. Moderna says they have one that has 94% efficacy. Pfizer now says that theirs has 95% efficacy. And I believe that the Sputnik vaccine in Russia the claim is about 90% efficacy. And yet, as we see all of that, we also see that the public says, only about 50% of the public says they'd even be willing to take the vaccine. Why do you think there's such a disconnect?
It always happens like this with vaccines. Even before COVID came to us, we had many dangerous diseases and we had anti-vaccine movements. In my personal opinion, anti-vaccine movement is rooted into psychology, not into biotechnology or medicine. Therefore, I would not comment on it. But what I know is that today is the worst day for anti-vaccine movement, because at some point, it will become very clear that people who got vaccinated, they are much healthier than people who declined vaccination. So I fully agree with you that it's a huge problem for the entire humanity, those 50% of anti-vaccine people. But, well, maybe I sound harsh, but Maestro COVID will correct it.
So let me ask you this. The efficacy rates are unusually high so far. Obviously, they have to be verified, but the claims that are being made are unusually high. We're talking about, efficacy rates in the 90th percentile for 3 different vaccines. Now, if we look at the flu has had a vaccine and the results of those vaccines being tracked only since 2003 here in the U.S. But from what I have seen, the worst year, it was only 10% effective. The best year, it was only 60% effective. Now, we know that obviously the flu is constantly changing and there are different strains of flu and that plays into it. However, when you see companies saying we've never seen this virus before in history, and now we're moving in a totally different way to try to get control of the vaccine, right? Doesn't that alarm people to say a brand new vaccine comes along and all of a sudden you figure it out this fast with 90% efficacy? Isn't there a reason to distrust that?
No, for a very simple reason, because global science made such an amazing effort and success in studying coronavirus that now, only half a year, 1 year after it all started, we know a lot. It was proven by genomic studies, and I proudly have to cite Professor Bazykin and Professor Gelfand at SKoltech, Skolkovo, who published a very nice paper on that. These studies proved that surprisingly, this virus, this coronavirus, is much less variable and mutating than even flu and some other dangerous viruses. In flu virus, we have many subtypes. Each year, new subtype arrives. So far, in coronavirus, despite we sequenced tens of thousands sequences from all around the world, we observe very little variation, very little mutation, very low mutation rate in principally important area against which we will vaccinate. So genomics shows that we are lucky. And if it is shown by genomics, okay, let's trust it. Let's not believe that something is wrong with clinical trial. Let's believe that finally humanity is lucky to meet virus that is not that changing.
All right, so David, let me bring you back in because you mentioned about the idea that this suicide rate was not effective enough or large enough to really constitute concern. But we do have an issue of global poverty, do we not? I mean, the WHO, for their part, recently said that lockdowns around the world quite possibly doubled the global poverty rate. And if that is the case, how do we justify continuing to lock down if you're talking about doubling the global poverty rate? Isn't that a death sentence for millions of people?
I don't know. I'm an economist, so I'm not an expert on the poverty, vaccines, or things around the world. I didn't come on as an expert on vaccines, so I have no idea.
Well, the question wasn't about vaccine. It was about lockdown. The continuation of economic lockdowns doubling the global poverty rate.
I have no evidence that that's true.
Okay. Well, the WHO says it's true. So then the question would be, what do you believe is this?
There's no evidence of that.
Say again?
I have no evidence one way or the other. So people can make up stuff if they want. I deal in the world of evidence. I'm an economist. There's no evidence for that. So people can make that up, but I'm not going to comment on it. No idea.
Okay. So again, this is what the WHO has said. So let's assume that they're not lying. I'm assuming they're not.
WHO, feel free. I don't know anything about it. I didn't come on to talk about that. I don't know anything about it.
Right. So as an economist, how do we continue to lock down portions of society, not allowing people to work, not allowing people to go to work?
No idea.
What do you think the solution is?
To what?
We're talking about Are you okay?
Yeah, I don't know anything about this. This is not something I have any expertise on. So it's better to speak to people who have expertise on viruses, and really not a good idea for someone who doesn't know about it to comment on it.
So as an economist, though, you don't feel comfortable commenting on the economy?
I'm done. Thank you. I'm done.
Wow, that was incredible. Well, there you go. I guess apparently David Blanchflower doesn't believe as an economist he can comment on the economy. So, Dmitry, let's talk about what's happening now. I don't know what upset him or bothered him so much there, but the reality is when we talk about what's happening with the economy, when we talk about what's happening with the global poverty rate right now, and obviously you're focused on vaccines, but we have been told over and over and over again, if we can just get to a vaccine, things will be better. Right. And we can reopen. Remember, we were originally told we could reopen if we could just, keep people out of hospitals and off ventilators. That didn't happen. So the question for you becomes, do you believe that the vaccines that are being created right now, that are about to receive FDA emergency approval, which at least one of them will, likely more than that, if and when that happens, do things go back to normal? Because there are a lot of people who, as we said, are suspicious of vaccines to begin with, but they're also suspicious that things are not going to necessarily become better based upon the usage of that vaccine. What say you?
Okay, hold on. Things will never go back to normal ever. It is accepted already by two groups of people. First, healthcare system cannot go back to old normal because now it knows it must have extra capacity, extra beds for new viruses that will come. And big employees who send tens of thousands of people to remote work are not going to bring them back all. So two things will never go back to normal: healthcare and big corporations. The rest of society, small businesses who suffer from these terrible lockdowns, doctors who suffer from everyday threat to their health, these important groups of people will get better because doctors will get vaccinated and small towns will get guests who are vaccinated. So as you see, I agree that vaccination will not solve all the problems, but it will solve many problems.
Do you believe that these vaccines that are being created right now will require one dose, or are we going to suddenly be told it's got to be 2 or 3 or 4 doses, or does it become an ongoing annual vaccine similar to what we see with the flu?
Okay, come on. First of all, if you read newspapers and if you see clinical trials, you will see that most of current vaccines require 2 doses. So it's done already. If the clinical trial is the final legal document on a vaccine, if in clinical trial you need 2 doses, it's over. It's not going to be 1, it's not going to be 5. If you ask me, do I think revaccination will be needed in a year? I personally do not think so. I do believe that T-cell immunity that will come from this beautiful mRNA and adenovirus vaccine will go for at least several years. If you ask me, do I have scientific evidence that vaccination will not be needed in 1 year? I don't. Who knows? Okay.
Right. So in the event that you're saying you think it'll be, more than one time, but not an ongoing thing. Where does that leave us in terms of who do you think is the front runner right now? I mean, Moderna uses this, and I just want to break down a couple of these things. Moderna is using this mRNA style vaccine that's kind of a first of its kind in the way that it's been developed. Most of that technology came from NIH, NIAID, and U.S. taxpayers. That's what they're using. Pfizer has a different kind of vaccine. Johnson & Johnson, my understanding, has a different kind of vaccine. And then the Sputnik vaccine is different. Can you just give me a quick rundown of what makes these vaccines different from each other? And does one become more, for lack of a better term, legitimate in your mind compared to the others based on the technology?
Okay, so first of all, let me tell you that I'm a Russian scientist working in pharmaceutical innovation. So I'm proud of all 3 achievements from different angles. Moderna is amazing innovator. What they created is the pinnacle of biomedical and clinical science of the last 10 years. It will be the pride of biomedical science for the next 20 years. Sputnik, Russian vaccine, is a miracle of Russian scientists that is not as powerful as US one, and still they produce something that works brilliantly. I'm already vaccinated with Sputnik. I already have my antibodies coming from vaccination, so I know it works. So I'm proud for Sputnik. And Pfizer is the role model for the industry. It's a big company that partnered with German innovators that created beautiful infrastructure. So I love all of them. If you want to ask me what would be my recommendation to choose out of the 3, my recommendation is choose what is available in your backyard. In Russia, we have Sputnik, we will choose Sputnik. In US, you have Pfizer, you will have Pfizer. In Germany, they will have, in Germany, they will have Pfizer, and BioNTech, they will have Pfizer. And in US, you have Moderna, you will have Moderna. If you go into tiny details, Moderna is a little bit more convenient and stable than Pfizer. Sputnik is also a little bit more convenient. So tiny details don't play. They all are brilliant.
Right now, just from the data, and I just don't get mad and jump off the ship here when I ask you this, like our last guest did. But look, the survival rate from COVID, based on the numbers, is about 99.6% is the survival rate of people who get it. Now, obviously, those numbers change as more people get it. We get more data, and more data comes in. But one of the concerns, one of the fears that people have over getting a COVID vaccine is they say, well, for a lot of us, for a lot of healthy not older people, people without, cardiovascular disease, those kinds of things. For the average person who says, I may not need that vaccine, what do you say to them to say this is an important thing for everyone to get it? Or do you think everyone should get it or not get it?
I personally, I'm quite strict. I hope that we all live in civilized, educated society. We know that we live together. We have responsibilities to each other. So if I see somebody who doesn't want to get vaccinated without dramatic health emergency reasons, I am critical. Still, I also respect liberties of people. If somebody has religious belief that they should not be vaccinated, my suggestion is to keep these people self-isolated, but it may come to social tension if we keep self-isolated people who choose not to be vaccinated. So look, you're asking difficult question. If I had a magic button, I would press it so that each person would get vaccinated. Since I don't have magic button, well, there is nothing to discuss here.
There is no magic button for sure to make that happen. But here's a question. Do you believe that there should be mandatory or even forced vaccinations if necessary?
I believe, okay, now I will say ugly thing. So let me be careful. I believe that government, I believe that government does not have any tangible tool or vehicle to make vaccination mandatory, even in Russia. So you believe that Russian government is kind of despotic, but even in Russia they don't have tools. In America, it's even more than that. So, but I believe that government is entitled to play some ugly games with people who don't get vaccinated. The easiest game is to cancel their passport. So easy. If you have religion against vaccination, no problem, you don't travel. You stay at home in your home state, you enjoy scenery, but you don't travel, and you do not endanger other people.
But Professor, let me ask you this. Don't you believe, though, I mean, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is, let's say that you get a vaccine because you want to protect yourself. Let's say that I refuse to get a vaccine because I don't agree with it. Isn't the only person who's then in danger the one who doesn't get the vaccine, not the one who did get it? How am I endangering you if you've had it and I haven't?
Two answers. Answer number one, no single vaccine fully protects patient from the disease. Patients still can be infected and consequences can be dire. Although, as we know, the protection is high. Therefore, if we are social people respecting each other, even if I am not vaccinated and you are, I should not say that I am in risk and not you. I should respect even the minor probability of danger to your health. Second layer, well, let's be real. Of course, we will not be able to vaccinate even 50% of the people because of the whole range of reasons, economical, logistical, etc. So, again, I believe that during the last year, approximately 30 to 40% of population of US and Russia will be vaccinated. Other 60 are not necessarily anti-vaccine. They can be busy people who cannot reach hospital to get vaccinated. Anyway, if they start traveling around without being vaccinated, they do antisocial thing. So my suggestion is to limit them somehow.
Absolutely. Professor Dmitry Kulish of SKoltech, thank you so much for taking our questions and for answering some very tough ones there. We appreciate you taking the time to do so. Thank you. I want to bring in now Paul Hunter and Professor Paul Hunter into this conversation and cover some of the same ground and then move into some other ground as well. Professor, thanks for being on with us as part of our podcast here. And I want want to begin by just asking you a couple of questions here, especially from the point of view of people who say lockdowns are not the answer and they're destroying businesses and they're destroying the economy. Listen, we understand fully. This is a difficult conversation to have, and people have passionate views on many different sides. So we're just trying to get clarity as to what many of our experts believe are answers here. What do you believe is the answer moving into the end of this year and going into 2021 for people who say enough is enough, what we have been told has not been working?
Well, I think I can certainly understand a lot of that debate, and people on both sides of the argument are very vocal in their views. I think the issue is clear that if you want to suppress the epidemic, that some form of social restriction until we get vaccine is inevitable. Otherwise, we will get quite rapid growth. I think the tier system in the UK that we had in October did have value, and it was actually slowing the spread of the epidemic. And we saw towards the end of October that the epidemic started to actually level off. The problem with the UK system at the time, in my view, was that we didn't adequately place local authorities into the appropriate tier. So I certainly feel that we could have avoided the lockdown if we'd been more reactive in placing local authorities into the appropriate tier to control the infection. Coming out of lockdown, I think we'll be going back to some form of tier. Well, we are going back to some form of tier system. We've just heard that today from the Prime Minister. I think if we can get authorities into the appropriate tier, depending on the state of the epidemic in their areas, then I think we can control the epidemic. Yes, there is going to be a balance to be struck between the need to control the epidemic and to allow our children to continue to get their education and to allow the economy to do as best as it can within the current system. So, how you balance all those issues is never easy, sadly.
It is certainly not easy. We just had a long conversation about vaccines and about the upcoming vaccines from a host of different companies. But there's no question, as we discussed with our last guest, there are a lot of people who are very skeptical, and I don't even think skeptical is the right word, of those vaccines, whether or not they'll be as effective as the claims that are being made. And the reality is, Professor, we know that there is a significant portion of the population that is already saying we are not going to take these vaccines. The promise that we keep hearing from leaders is once we get the vaccine, things will, go back to normal. Can we trust even the word normal? Is there a new normal? Are we having to recognize that is the reality of where we're headed?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that I'm actually quite confident that we will have really effective, safe vaccines coming on stream within a matter of weeks. And I have no doubt that those vaccines will make a big difference to the pandemic and to the control of the pandemic across much of the world. But you're quite right. There will be a proportion, possibly a substantial proportion of the population that will decline vaccine. And in societies like ours, we cannot ignore that group, and we cannot say, well, because you've not had the vaccine, we will, you take the consequences of that. We have to continue to provide, where possible, a safe environment for them. But even with vaccine, the virus isn't going to go away. And I suspect, I've been saying our grandchildren's grandchildren will certainly experience the infection. This has happened before. There are two other very similar beta coronaviruses that have been circulating for decades, and probably centuries, that made the jump some 100 plus years ago. What happens is that we get into some sort of harmony where they still cause infections, but they generally just cause the common cold. And what we've got to do is try and arrange for society to continue without as many fatalities as we would otherwise until we get to that sort of balanced state.
So how do we get to a balanced state when we have on one side the medical issue, right? And the other side we have the economic issue. And we were trying to have this discussion earlier, but the WHO for their part has come out and said that coronavirus lockdowns globally have contributed to quite possibly a doubling of global poverty. That alone becomes, for many millions of people, quite possibly, we don't know yet, but quite possibly it becomes a death sentence for many, many millions of people. And we're talking about people in third world countries, people around the world who have no upward mobility whatsoever in their nations to begin with. So when you double that global poverty rate, that creates an enormous, you mentioned our children's children. It creates a generational problem, does it not?
Yeah, I would not disagree at all with you. I think one of the issues, though, with the argument is that often people who say that tend to assume or tend to portray the fact that if we hadn't done any lockdowns, then we wouldn't have had experienced any of the economic hardships. You know, any epidemic that kills more than 1 million people is going to generate economic hardships anyway. The issue is how you manage that in a way that the epidemic doesn't actually by itself destroy the economy, but at the same time, those restrictions do the least harm to the economy, and that's a difficult balancing act. And you know, to be honest, is not a balancing act that public health physicians like myself are most appropriate to make. That has to be made by politicians taking into account the economics, the public health requirements, the social and educational needs. Now, if we'd not done anything at all, if we'd not had the lockdown in spring, this summer would have been a dreadful, dreadful situation in the UK. I'm absolutely convinced that the lockdown in April was necessary and essential. I think what we have to do, though, now is, as we move forward, have restrictions where they're necessary, but make sure that we're doing the right thing as quickly as possible, and that where we are applying local restrictions, that they are responsive, they react quickly when things are going out of control in a location, and we relax them as soon as possible when things are coming back under control. And to me, that's the way that we can manage the epidemic in a way that minimizes the economic harm until the point that we get a vaccine. What
you mentioned,
the situation
Professor,
will be like. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, wait, you mentioned about confidence
like after April is it's very difficult to predict at the moment, but I don't think we'll be back to normal. But I think things will be a lot easier in the Northern Hemisphere once we've got through March and into April.
So you mentioned about politicians a minute ago, and you said ultimately they're the ones who have to make a lot of those decisions. And certainly in the UK, it sounds like you have some confidence in the decisions that have been made, certainly, as you said, back in the spring. I will tell you, here in the U.S., there is a lack of confidence, certainly for politicians, in the decisions they make, because many of the policies that seem to be pushed forward don't seem to be consistent. Right. So, for instance, they'll keep liquor stores open, but then they'll close churches. They'll allow in some states, they allow strip clubs to open, but churches cannot. Right. So there's an I know it's an inconsistency, certainly in terms of policy. And then we have a whole issue. You know, the governor of New Jersey, Phil Murphy, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, people who are in the federal government, for instance, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who will, on one hand, tell us all the things that we must do as good citizens to help protect the world around us, and then are caught not doing it themselves. And I think the hypocrisy when a politician does that, how damaging is that to any attempt to actually convey confidence in the public?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I wouldn't want you to go away with the idea that I'm necessarily confident in our own politicians here on this side of the Atlantic. We have seen some situations in the UK that have been very damaging to the way this epidemic is controlled. We've seen a number of very senior politicians, political advisors, advisors to the government on this epidemic, themselves doing things that they have been promoting not to do. And there's been research that shows that that has actually had a damaging impact on people's ability and trust in the government. When one of the senior advisors of the government decided to travel to the other end of the country and then go for a ride in his car with his family whilst they were supposed to be self-isolating, that actually had a very bad impact on the public perception of the government and the public's willingness to go along with the restrictions. Yes, we have to have public health control measures. Those apply to everybody, and they should apply to everybody, whatever position in society that you hold. Otherwise, the ordinary person in the street doesn't know what to do, and probably doesn't want to do it anyway because people that they see on television were flouting the rules, and I think that has had a very negative impact in the way we've been able to manage the epidemic in the UK.
Should politicians be punished when they act in that way? Do you believe that obviously they push for, strict rules that they can impose on the rest of us. Should the rules go the other way, though, that if you are someone making these kinds of orders and you yourself cannot follow them, should there be some consequence?
Well, I would say so, yes. I mean, I think anybody who openly flouts the rules needs to give up their authority to advise the rest of the UK. And we have seen that. Interestingly, on the scientist side, where one of our scientists broke the rules, and one in Scotland, the senior chief medical officer in Scotland broke the rules herself. Both of those people took what I consider to be the honourable decision and resigned. But we've seen since then politicians who have and political operatives who have broken the rules don't feel the same need to resign, and that's not a party political decision, because politicians on both sides of the House of Commons have actually broken the rules and are still in the House of Commons.
Last thing I would ask you, Professor, is in terms of this virus itself, which has a 99.6 survival rate. Is that a correct number? First of all, let me ask you that. Is that a correct number?
Sorry, could you say that again? A
99.6% survival rate.
Yeah, it's probably about right. I mean, it does vary from one place to another, but between about the infection mortality rate is probably now somewhere between 0.5% and 1%. In the spring, it was quite a bit greater than that, but death rates have fallen quite a bit since then as a result of better and improved treatment.
Right. So with a 99.6% survival rate, a little bit of a tongue twister there are people who will look at it and say, but if you have this kind of survival rate, why are we taking as many drastic measures still? We know a lot more about the virus than we did, a year ago, than we did 9 months ago, than we did even 3 months ago. Why is it that we're still continuing to say things like no gatherings of 10 or more people, shut down here in the U.S. Thanksgiving celebrations, there won't be Christmas this year, Virginia? I mean, we really see this idea being pushed very hard. And I got to tell you, there are many millions of people who look at it and say, why? Why are we treating it this way when so many, the vast majority of people who get this virus do not die from it? last word.
Yeah, well, I mean, half of 1% of people dying doesn't actually sound a lot until you extrapolate that to a population. So even if you take the UK, there's about 200 million people live in the United States. Assume 100, half of those get the infection and half of 1% die. So that is, that is getting on for 500,000 to 1 million deaths from the infection in the United States if it was left to run its natural course. Is that an acceptable number of deaths? Especially as many of those would be preventable. And also, it's not just the deaths. We know more about what's called long COVID now. We do know that many people who have COVID infection never, or at the time, haven't actually properly recovered. They've got residual lung damage. They've got residual neurological problems. Many of these people are going to put a substantial burden on healthcare systems over coming months and years. So it's not just deaths. And some of these other problems actually apply to younger people as well. It's not just the elderly that suffer these. And so, yeah, I mean, deaths are a big problem, but also ultimately the extra economic burden of long COVID could ultimately be more of an economic problem and more of a societal problem than the fatalities.
Professor Paul Hunter, we thank you for your time and all of your insight on this
My
issue.
pleasure.
Thank you very much. All right, let's bring in Jeffrey Tucker now with the American Economic Institute, I believe. And Jeffrey, I believe we have you with us right now. And I want to start with you talking about and pushing back on some of these. You have a very different point of view. I know that for a fact. And that you have your view essentially is that picking up right where this professor left off, with a 99.6% survival rate, he talked about long COVID. But I guess we could also define long COVID as the overall economic and social damage being caused by lockdown, correct?
It's overwhelming. I mean, the denial of children's education, we're sacrificing a whole generation of children, denying them access to schooling, the amount of cancer treatments that are not taking place. We've abolished Thanksgiving. What the hell are we doing? And can I just address really quickly what our nice professor friend said? I don't understand how these scientists can get on international television and say things that are just outrageously misleading like that. You can't take a case fatality ratio that's gleaned from a heterogeneous population with huge gradients of risk, apply it to a population of whole and split the numbers and claim that the X number of people are going to die. I mean, that is fake science that was said right here, right before I came on. And this gentleman, as nice as he is, knows this. The risk is not equal for all populations. The average age of death.
Let me just say real quick that the professor's not with us anymore, so he can't respond to what you're saying. But help us to understand. So essentially, but the question that I had asked him was about the 99.6% survival rate. He extrapolated from that overall population size and said that if 100% of the population were to contract it at this rate, therefore it would equal this many deaths. That's what you're responding to?
Yes. What he said is that if half the population contracts it at this current case fatality rate that he estimates to be, I forget what he said, 0.5% or something like that, then X numbers will die. And he did some math in his head. I mean, this is not science, especially since. So the problem with the infection fatality rate or the case fatality rate, those are slightly different things, although that's been obscured over the last year with PCR tests. That's an average of the whole population. But if you break that down, what you find is that the risk is radically heterogeneous throughout the whole population. Like, I can't believe I'm having to say this. This has been known since March that the risk for healthy people under 40 versus unhealthy people over 70 is is 1,000 times less. I mean, so you can't just take an average and apply it to the whole population as if we're looking at a homogeneous gradients of risk across the whole population. That's unscientific, and it denies everything we know about COVID. I mean, let me just give you a classic, or what to me is a salient example in this case. Everybody's all over Governor Kristi Noem for South Dakota for more or less preserving normal life, right? And they're saying, oh, your cases are up. Okay, cases are not deaths. Now, it's true that South Dakota has a very high rate of deaths per million, deaths per capita. But once you actually dig down deep into that data, what you find is that only 21 people under the age of 40 have died with a attribution of COVID-19. So that is a minuscule, tiny risk relative to the overall risk. So why is the cases, deaths per million so high in South Dakota? Well, look at the number of long-term care facilities they have. They're very high numbers of very old and sick people in South Dakota. I'm sorry to say, but that's just absolutely true. And if we're going to analyze the risk profile of SARS-CoV-2, we cannot do so without a serious look at the demographics. And if you're hearing some expert on TV fail to mention this, you are not being told what's true.
So I want to talk to you about the Great Barrington Declaration, because this is something that you helped to craft and put together. I think it's one of the most underreported and undercovered issues of kind of the COVID pushback, if you want to call it that. Maybe that's not the right term, but it's essentially this idea that while so many scientists, science being the key word here, right? The science about COVID is settled. You got a lot of doctors and scientists who are pushing back, who are debating some of these ideas through this declaration, correct? Can you describe for our audience what it is, what the declaration is, where it came from, and how many have signed on?
Sure. You know, to be clear, I had nothing to do with the drafting of it. I'm the steward of the house that hosted the scientists, basically. That's a kind of a good way to look at it. But what happened was that, you know, early on in the lockdowns, a lot of people were quiet. A lot of scientists were quiet because they were just confused, like, why is what's happening contradict everything I learned about public health in my entire life? There must be some rationale, must be some reason. And after a little bit of delay, maybe we're talking about 2 or 3 months, finally, scientists began to speak out. And I happen to notice one of them is Martin Kulish from Harvard, who's an epidemiologist and a statistician, and one of the people involved in evaluating vaccines and their effectiveness on the community. He looked at what was happening with the carnage from the lockdowns, and he began to tweet about it. Right? He started a Twitter account because he felt like he had a moral responsibility to speak out. He's told me in private. He said, you know, I have this Harvard position, and whatever 200. Citations and medical literature and stuff, and I never really understood what I was supposed to do other than just do what I do, which is my science. But now I realize I have an obligation, in a sense, to humanity to speak out, even though I know I'm contradicting this strange, peculiar new orthodoxy that's going on. And so I dropped him a note. I said, listen, if you need a weekend retreat, you know, come see us here. So he said, okay, I'll be right there. And he came by, and I invited a few other anti-lockdown, I don't know, lawyers and smart people. And we just talked about COVID all weekend. And then about 10 days later, he called me and he said, look, I think we need to do something about this. He said, he's very sweet. He said, the journalists apparently are deeply ignorant about immunology, epidemiology, and its relationship to public health. Let's have a conference in Great Barrington where we invite New York Times, British Medical Journal, and some other important journalists to just basically learn, you know, the fundamental facts of cell biology. That's a good idea. When's it going to happen? He said, well, given the level of crisis, I think it has to happen this weekend. So we scrambled pretty hard, but very in short order, Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford and Sunetra Gupta from Oxford and Martin Kulish from Harvard were here, and we had an event. And then after the initial discussions, they said, why don't we write an open letter to the world and invite people to sign it? And they suggested, they called it the Great Barrington Declaration, after the name of the town. And within 36 hours, it was released to the world. And since that time, about 40,000 scientists around the world have signed it. And in addition to many other academics, historians, economists, philosophers, and so on, humanitarians from the left and the right, it just doesn't matter. What's going on in the world is so crazy that people were desperate, it turns out, for some sort of way to express their disapproval to these policies and endorse public health as traditionally understood. And so now I think we have close to 700,000 signatures on the website, and I think it has made a real difference. It was their moral courage, I think, inspired many other people to finally speak out.
Yeah, and so tell me about the Barrington Declaration itself. So the Great Barrington Declaration is designed to essentially say that the policies that have been put in place so far, and again, these are policies that are being pushed by politicians, by some scientists, but mostly by politicians, it seems, don't really match up with science.
Yeah, that's right. So the Great Barrington Declaration begins with a basic recitation of the facts that SARS-CoV-2 came to us and that we immediately locked down, and they discuss all the carnage. The fact that the hospital stopped accepting elective surgeries, which means cancer screenings and all the things we'd normally use medical services for just went away. And in the United States, anyway, 350 hospitals over the spring and summer actually furloughed workers because their hospitals were empty since all the medical services were reserved for COVID. But anyway, the Great Barrington Declaration, which is not long, basically states the cost of lockdowns and then offers an alternative strategy, observing that the risk profile of this particular virus, which is all you should really care about in the event of a new virus, which is who is vulnerable with faces of mortal risk from this. That's what we've always cared about in the past. And they point out that it's 1,000 times more for people over 70 with comorbidities than it is for younger people. We should not have closed the schools. And what they urge, and they further point out that we cannot live in a zero COVID world, that the virus, like millions of other viruses, if not billions, is here, and we for a million years we've adapted to them. And how do we adapt to them? Through herd immunity, which is a point of cell biology and probability mathematics, actually, if you think about it. Like, the virus has to be smart enough to find another host. If it kills the host, the virus burns out. At some point, when there's enough immunity built up in a population, then the virus dies out and becomes endemic. It doesn't go away. It becomes endemic, which is another word for predictable and also manageable, which I think is.
But there is a reality here, Jeffrey.
My friends tell me it's happening. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, the other issue here is that throughout human history, herd immunity has been developed by populations. It's how humans survive. The idea now that the only way herd immunity can be reached, obviously it can be helped by a vaccine, but the only way it can be reached is through a vaccine. It just seems to me to be maybe the ultimate twisting of science and the ultimate twisting of our understanding of medical practice, right? That until a pharmaceutical company comes up with the answer for us, no one can do anything. And that's where I'm getting the most pushback from people of saying, why is it we're supposed to believe we cannot resume any life until we've taken the shot? And even if that is the case, life may not resume.
It's the strangest aspect of what we're living through right now, and I've resisted this idea that the lockdowns are being driven by the pharmaceutical companies, because it sounds like too much of a conspiracy theory. But there is something very weird going on. I mean, in the course of normal life, for however long human life has existed, our immune systems have adapted to new pathogens as they come along. In fact, it's one of the most extraordinary observations from Sunetra Gupta, who's who's at Oxford, who's like a philosopher of infectious diseases in some way, that she observed that in the 20th century we've had so much trade and so much travel and so much contact with people who are unlike ourselves. We have the least naive immune systems in history, and this accounts for but in part for why we live such long lives, that we've developed so much exposure that our immune systems have gotten stronger. I mean, our immune systems exist for a reason, and that's the strangest thing about 2020 is that we've pretended as if the immune system, doesn't exist at all, which is very strange because it's like zeroing out all the knowledge we've had for 100 years. It's like it's suddenly gone, and we think that the only cure for disease is for people to sit in labs and concoct some potion that they're going to inject into us. And there's a lot of confusion about what this potion consists of. I think the popular understanding of vaccines is that it builds a wall, between you and the disease. Kind of like, if you download a virus protection program on your computer and the virus comes in and then the computer stops it from infecting your hard drive, right? That's how people think of vaccines and their relationship to viruses. I actually think this is a linguistic confusion. The only way in the biological and natural world that vaccines work is by interplaying with a functioning immune system. So it can give your immune system a kick. And we sometimes they perform miracles. Look what happened to smallpox. I mean, that's a glorious and the signature case of the best vaccine that we've ever had. But the problem is the vaccine is not necessary for people who otherwise can develop natural immunities. And it's a good thing to develop natural immunities. A natural immunity is naturally acquired immunity is always safer and effective than any vaccine. And especially for mild respiratory illnesses, which SARS-CoV-2 is. And I'm saying this not as I'm an economist, not a cell biologist, but I'm relying on the authority of others in observing that. But the other problem is that the vaccine will be ineffective for people without functioning immune systems. And it's an empirical question. How many of the people who have died from COVID-19 have had non-functioning immune systems, in which case they would not have been improved by the existence of a vaccine at all? I don't know the answer to that. Is it 20%, 50%, 90%? I don't know. It's an empirical question, but the fact that this isn't even being discussed is, to me, something of a scandal.
I have one more question for you before I let you go, Jeffrey, and it is an economics question. It's also a markets question, free markets question. We have this talk of vaccines, certainly the Moderna vaccine. The mRNA technology that's been developed there was not Moderna's development. It actually was developed by government scientists working in the NIH. Moderna signed a contract with the NIH in December of last year to start working on projects together. But it's already been established that not only does it not belong to Moderna, but scientists from the NIH have actually filed for patents alongside Moderna so that they can make money off of this. My question for you is, if U.S. taxpayers in Operation Warp Speed spent $2 billion on a Pfizer vaccine, they spent $2 billion going to Moderna for their vaccines, should these companies be allowed to charge, or should the vaccines themselves be free to the public? How do we have government-funded scientists developing in government-funded programs the vaccine technology, which is then paid for in advance to the development to these companies, and then we're still supposed to pay for vaccines when the time comes?
And Ben, let's just be clear about what a patent amounts to. It means a legal protection for one company to be the sole producer of what would easily be reverse engineered by other people. So there's nothing free market about a patent, and nothing free market about a pharmaceutical patent especially. It's basically a government privilege towards a capitalistic company that does not want to compete in the market. So I think you ask a really important question here. And I think in the coming years, we're really going to have to come to terms with this. I mean, Ben, really the question is, did we destroy New York? Did we destroy the United States? Did we destroy the world and any semblance of what we used to call human rights and civilization so that a handful of companies could make monopoly profits by enforcing patents, contrary to all market logic, that is a terrifying question, and it's actually almost too much for me to even contemplate right now. But we're going to have to come to terms with it.
Yeah, I think we do have to come to terms with it. And I think this idea that when we talk about, what is happening to our economies, because it's not just one economy, right? It's economies around the world, and it's certainly multiple economies throughout the United States, and what people are living through and struggling with. When we hear the talk of what happens in the next 6 months, the next year, 2021, does the entire year also become part of the system? And if that is the case, Jeffrey, are we looking at a realignment of global economics? And certainly companies like Amazon, certainly the big tech companies and corporations seem to be doing fine during these times, but it's those small businesses. Does COVID have the potential to wipe out the middle class, not just in America, but worldwide?
It seems to be that's what we're trying to do. We've created a new feudalism, and I'll just tell you a little bit of an anecdote, what I'm talking about here. Primitive societies or pre-modern societies always assigned to some one class to bear the burden of herd immunity on behalf of a ruling class. And I think that's what we're doing here. I must tell you, I went out to a restaurant last night. There's something profoundly disturbing about watching fancy people sit at dinner, sucking down cocktails and enjoying fancy food, while a wait staff and cooks and everybody is wearing gloves and masks as if they're the unclean people that service us. That is not the way we do it under freedom and democracy and equality. This is wrong, it's disgusting, and it is absolutely heartbreaking. And what I just described is a microcosm of what's happening all over the world. The ruling class is getting its way using largely bogus science and state coercion in a way that's at the expense of our health, our families, our religions, our faith, everything we've ever valued, our national traditions, everything, our right to travel, everything we've ever valued. And the only people who are winning from these lockdowns are the ruling class. Every day I've woken up for the last 11 months and 10 months and hoped it would be over. And I don't think we can give up hope. I just hope that, that tomorrow, we'll wake up in the morning and realize we're not going to put up with this anymore, and we are going to go back to public health, freedom, democracy, some semblance of equality and normalcy, so we can get on with building civilization instead of destroying it.
Jeffrey Tucker, thank you so much for your time and for all of your insight. And I think I'll walk away from this interview with the phrase, "We have the least naive immune systems in history." That's going to stick with me. Appreciate your time. Thank you. Let's bring on Dr. Scott Jensen. He is a state senator in the state of Minnesota, but he is a physician. And I am excited to bring him on because there is this part of this discussion that I think is so critically important. And Scott, it's good to have you on here. I got to tell you, you post these Facebook videos where you're explaining your situation, what's been happening with you. I reshare them all the time because I think that your story is such an important story for people to hear. You are a physician, and you have had now your medical license, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, challenged now twice, going before the medical board because of comments that you have made about the response to coronavirus, correct?
That's correct.
Tell me about the comments that you made that were reported. What did you say?
Well, the first time around, I was accused of spreading misinformation because I had compared COVID-19 to influenza in a fashion similar to what Dr. Fauci and Dr. Mike Osterholm in Minnesota have done. So I was astonished about that. I was also accused of providing reckless advice. And that was in late June, and then that was dismissed in late July. And then in August, another investigation was initiated. And that time I was identified as a danger to public health because I took the 2009 swine flu pandemic and tried to draw comparisons between it and our present situation in regards to a variety of features: seasonality, length of time, what kinds of mitigating measures might have been tried in 2009 versus 2020. And for that, I was a danger to public health. And then that was dismissed in October. So right now, I'm happily not being investigated.
And we're glad to hear that. But I have to ask you, there is a whole other part of this story, right? Which is, we have the politicians and what they're saying, and we have separately from that this idea that scientists and doctors are all in one mindset. Jeffrey Tucker just talked about the 40,000 scientists and doctors who have signed his declaration. There seems to be an absolute just squashing of any voice that says something that is contrarian. If you say something to the contrary of what social media companies have deemed as acceptable, if you say something that's contrary about coronavirus, you are immediately not just censored, but threats against your livelihood, against your ability to practice medicine. I mean, it just seems, we hear so much talk today about stand up against fascism. It seems like such a fascist idea.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think back to March, I was attacked by bureaucrats because they said that I was minimizing the impact of COVID-19. And I simply was trying to provide context. In our country, I think a lot of folks don't realize that we have almost 10,000 people die every day in the United States. 1 out of 100 people in the United States dies every year. We have something in excess of 300 million people, but 3 million people die every year. These are not alarmist statements. These are not conspiratorial statements. These are facts. And so when I started being criticized in March, and then in April, I saw the, if you will, the bogus advice we were getting as to how to complete death certificates, I said, well, this is crazy. And then in May, I was being criticized by some of my colleagues in the Senate because they felt I was trivializing the present situation. And I'm not trying to trivialize it. I'm just trying to provide some reasonable perspective. And then June, July, August, September, I spent defending my license. I don't think there's any question that there is a divide that is astonishing. I mean, I lived through the 1960s civil rights movement. I lived through the Vietnam peace. This is remarkable. And honestly, I think one of the notable sources of blame belongs on physicians. I don't think that we have held up science at the level we should. Science is just three things. It's observation, it's measure, and then it's hypothesize. Create a hypothesis that would explain what you saw and measured, and then develop an experiment to either confirm or deny your hypothesis and ask other scientists to do the same. It's at that point that we have science. But if you actually look at what we did in 2009 and look at what we're doing now, everything changed on a dime 4 or 5 months ago. There was no randomized control. Yes, I'm talking about if you look at what we did with influenza, with 2009 swine flu, and look at what we're doing now and the mitigating policies. In 2009, we did not close schools lock, stock, and barrel. We did not lock down. We did not go crazy about the value of masks. We did not do any of these things in 2009. Everything flipped about 4 or 5 months ago, not because we had good science, randomized controlled studies, double-blinded studies, peer-reviewed studies. We had just a lot of panic and fear, and we had a lot of gobbledygook, a lot of mud thrown on the wall, and we were just picking and choosing, and everybody saying, heavens to Betsy, the sky is falling, we've got to do something, so we're going to make a mask mandate. Fine, that's not a hill I'm going to die on. But I think if we have vulnerable people thinking that they're doing what they need to do by wearing a mask, we're hurting them because we're actually lulling them into potential care. Full focus on protecting the vulnerable people. That's where your quarantines go. That's who gets the most support. But what we've done is flipped it around. We've said we're going to take the population of people that are least vulnerable, the 0 to 30-year-olds, and we're going to lock them down. We're going to say no school. We're going to say no phonetics, no ability to learn how to talk and write as a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old with a teacher having no mask on. What we've done, we will pay for decades.
Well, and I think to that point, as we've been talking about this today, that seems to be the place of disconnect for most Americans and a lot of people around the world. I mean, we see protest movements happening in Germany. This past weekend, there was a huge protest in Germany of people pushing back against the second round of lockdowns. But I think this idea that for a lot of people, there is a huge disconnect between what they see as the reality of what's going on around them, the people around them, the people they know who have contracted it. Remember, back in April and May, very few people knew anyone who had contracted COVID. Now, many people know people who have contracted it. And so what we see around us versus what we're being told, and it feels like that's where if for lack of a better term, a rebellion to this idea seems to be growing from, is that I'm seeing something with my eyes, but you're telling me not to trust my eyes. You're telling me not to trust what I do know in exchange for what I don't know that you were telling me. What can people do to become smarter about this issue, to become more informed on this without having to just swallow whatever they're hearing in the media?
Well, I think you just made a very good point. You said, other than just swallowing what they see in the media, I would say this. I would say that initially we talked about a divide or a fracture of the trust. Then we started to see people saying what you said. What you're telling me isn't matching up with what I'm seeing. So at that point in time, we moved from trust to a fracture of trust to disbelief. When you move from disbelief to the next step, it depends upon what's happening to you in your individual life. If your individual life is being hyper-controlled, damaged, you now start to react with anger. And I think that's where you're seeing today. I think, and that's made the divide bigger, because we have on one side people say, do whatever the government tells us to do. And you have another group saying, listen, we've moved from fractured trust to disbelief. We're angry now. And I think that's what we're seeing. And honestly, I participated in the World Doctors Alliance. I participated by Zoom in Trafalgar Square demonstrations and in Copenhagen. And I've been with the frontline doctors in this country. The Barrington Declaration was a very reasonably well-stated alternative to how we're doing things. And that was just unbelievably criticized. So we're now seeing attacks come left and right, and people are just exhausted. And yet they're looking at some of the data and they're saying, well, hold it. If on the testing, we're told over and over again that they're running too many cycles, and that it may well be that more than 50% in some samplings are false positives, and the case fatality rate is actually, the infectious fatality rate is dropping, they're saying, I just can't buy what you're selling. And honestly, I don't even know if I want to listen anymore. And that's a dangerous place too.
Absolutely. Dr. Swann, thank you so much for taking the time out today to meet with us and to discuss all of this. And again, congratulations on not having to deal right now with medical device. Hopefully it will stay that way. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
So let's bring on...
AstraZeneca are the latest company to join the frontrunners in the COVID-19 vaccine race, announcing an efficacy of 70% after concluding their phase 3 trials. Now, though these preliminary results may sound humble compared to other vaccines, the company's CEO is optimistic, saying the jab will be highly effective and will have an immediate impact. With the UK having already pre-ordered 100 million jabs, Boris Johnson is more than happy with the results.
Incredibly exciting news. The Oxford vaccine has proved so effective in trials. There are still further safety checks ahead, but these are fantastic results. Well done to our brilliant scientists at the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca, and all who volunteered in the trials.
So, why the relatively low efficacy? Well, developers say that 70% figure is an average of 2 dosage regimens. 2 high doses gave a result of 62%, with a high dose following a low one raising efficacy to 90%. Now, this 70% average figure is therefore lower than trial results announced earlier by Moderna at 95%, also Pfizer at 95%, though that company raised their efficacy from an initial 90% result, with the Russian Sputnik V vaccine standing at 92%. Now, these figures are crucial given the highly competitive nature of the market, and it's been a bumpy road for AstraZeneca. Now, today, as these results were published, the company's shares actually fell on the back of the lower than expected average efficacy, even as European stocks rose on the good news of another vaccine entering the market. Now, the vaccine trials had to be halted in September because of a serious suspected adverse reaction in a participant. And in October, one of the volunteers in Brazil died, causing uncertainty about its future.
Why the advanced trial of a promising vaccine was suddenly paused.
AstraZeneca has paused its trials after an unexplained illness in a participant in the UK.
As one company makes huge strides in the vaccine race, another drug giant hits the pause button on its late-stage trials.
A volunteer in one of the most advanced coronavirus vaccine trials in the world has died. And despite the news, AstraZeneca's testing continues.
Well, those adverse effects were investigated, and though the company and the Brazilian health authority refused to comment in detail on the case, the trial was deemed safe to continue. Though in the United States, the delay lasted several weeks, and today's results don't include data from American trials. Well, despite the lower efficacy, the upside to this vaccine is cost effectiveness. While the estimated price of the Pfizer vaccine is around $19, the Moderna jab between $25 to $37, those prices go up to over $40 and as high as $74, respectively, for the total treatment. The cost of the Sputnik V vaccine is estimated at $26 per treatment, though final costs are yet to be announced. The AstraZeneca jab will not only be easier to manufacture and store, but the cost for both doses could be as low as $8. Well, the race is now on to register these vaccines. AstraZeneca stated it would seek emergency use listing from the World Health Organization, with Russia saying they've already begun the Sputnik V registration process. Despite the good news, it's too early to say we've seen the back of the pandemic, even with these promising trial results.
This is not the time for complacency. While we continue to receive encouraging news about COVID-19 vaccines and remain cautiously optimistic about the potential for new tools to start to arrive in the coming months. Right now, we're extremely concerned by the surging cases we're seeing in some countries, particularly in Europe and the Americas. Health workers and health systems are being pushed to the breaking point.
Even with several vaccines hitting the market in coming months, with the world in the grip of the second COVID-19 wave, there's still a very long and difficult road ahead until we see a return to at least some semblance of normality.
So again, a lot of information there specific to these vaccines, the different vaccines that are about to hit the market. So joining us now to go more in depth on that particular issue is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He is with Children's Health Defense. And Robert, great to have you here. I really wanted you to be on this program today because of this issue specific to these vaccines. And I want to start with this question. AstraZeneca says 72% efficacy. Their stock dropped because of that. But the other three, Moderna, 94% efficacy, Pfizer, 95% efficacy, and Sputnik V, 92% efficacy. How can we believe these kinds of efficacy rates when we know that the best a flu vaccine has ever done is 60% efficacy, according to the FDA? Why would we believe that these vaccines all suddenly got it exactly right the first time around and in record time?
Well, my reaction, Ben, is actually that. Well, let's talk about how they get those numbers. The way that they get those numbers is Pfizer gave 22,000 people the vaccine and 22,000 people the placebo. And then it waited until 100 people got sick from COVID, and it was double-blinded, supposedly, which we have to assume is true for the moment. And that means that neither the researchers nor the subjects, the volunteers or recruits, knew whether they were getting the placebo or the vaccine. And they wait for 100 of those people to get sick. And they waited till 95 people got sick, and then they unblind the study. And they look at how many of those people were from the vaccine group and how many of them were from the placebo group. And as it turned out, 95% of the people in the Pfizer study were from the vaccine group. And so that's good news. There's a couple of good things about the mRNA vaccine, if they can actually get it to work, which I'm skeptical about, but I'm very open to, if they can get it to work, it would be much better. It would be preferable to traditional vaccines because it doesn't have the kind of ingredients. It doesn't need an adjuvant. It doesn't have aluminum. It doesn't have mercury preservatives. It doesn't have formaldehyde. And, some of them, the Moderna one doesn't have human fetal tissue. And so it's potentially a safer vaccine than the typical ones that and the vaccines that we're getting today. The question we have is, how long does the immunity last? Is there immune enhancement? In other words, are there a certain percentage of people who are going to get the vaccine and actually get sicker from COVID, which is what they've seen in the past? And then the question is the side effects. And for the Moderna vaccine, 100% of the people had some adverse effects, many of them mild, after the second dose in the phase 1 trial. 20% of the high dose, 21% of the high dose group had serious effects, meaning hospitalizations or medical intervention required. 6% of the low dose group had serious side effects. So that means that it's a dose-related response, which is indicia of toxicity. The question is now, we have not seen Pfizer's safety data. So if Pfizer's safety data looks anything like that, then we have to question ourselves, is it better to get COVID for most age groups or to get the vaccine? If you're under 55, your chance of suffering an injury from the vaccine is about 1/10 according to CDC's own data, about 1/10 of the serious injury and death rate of the seasonal flu. So for that age group, any injury would be unacceptable from the vaccine, because if you're not going to get hurt by COVID, why would you take a vaccine that has maybe a 10% chance of hurting you? And particularly, we don't know what happens to people who have comorbidities. And so we really need to parse through the safety data and look at the safety impacts for particularly seniors, for elderly, for the fragile elderly, and for people with comorbidities. Right now, one of the problems with the way that they did that test, Ben, is that nobody in the test died. So we don't know whether the vaccine prevents deaths or whether it prevents injuries, serious injuries, because those weren't tested for. And as you pointed out with the flu vaccine, what the Cochrane collaboration and what BMJ have said about the flu vaccine is that there is no proof that the flu vaccine prevents any hospitalizations or any deaths. You have to give between 70 and 100 flu vaccines to prevent one case of mild illness. And in some cases of mild illness, it may make moderate symptoms more mild. Do we really want an $18 billion vaccine program that just makes moderate symptoms more mild in some affected people if it does nothing to prevent injuries, serious injuries, and deaths? And nobody can say that about this vaccine. We just don't know, because the tests, as Peter Doshi from the British Medical Journal said, and as Dr. Hazeltine from Harvard said, these trials were designed to succeed. They weren't designed to tell us whether this vaccine is going to prevent any injuries or any deaths, or whether it blocks transmissibilities. And this is the big issue. According to Tony Fauci, these vaccines do not block transmissibility. That means you get and we know that in the monkey trials, the AstraZeneca vaccine, the monkeys were still, after they got the vaccine, their symptoms became milder, but they were still transmitting COVID. So what happens when you give the population these vaccines and it doesn't prevent those same people from transmitting the disease? You simply turn them all into asymptomatic carriers, and that doesn't end the lockdown. It doesn't end the mask.
And isn't that
end all other precautions?
even that idea, I mean, what you just said about asymptomatic carriers, if that is the case, if and I haven't, studied it well enough to know if that would be the case, but if that were the case, that it turned everyone who got the vaccine into an asymptomatic carrier, doesn't that do precisely what we're trying to prevent by creating lockdowns in the first place, by making people wear masks?
Exactly. It turns us all into kind of typhoid Marys. There was a very, very important study that was published this morning in Nature, and it was published by the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It was an extensive study that was conducted with the cooperation of the Chinese government, where they tested 10 million people. They were trying to figure out whether there is asymptomatic transmission in COVID. And what their conclusion was in this study is that there is no asymptomatic transmission. They tested 10 million people with not PCR tests, which, as you know, often exaggerate the, give us a lot of false positives, but they tested them with accurate testing. And of the 10 million people they found, I think there was only about 300 of them that were asymptomatic. And who were carriers, who tested positive and they didn't show symptoms. And they went out and they did extensive contact tracing, which they can do in China because everybody is followed around. And they were able to trace every single person that those 300 people ever came into contact with. And there was no case of asymptomatic transmission. So the scientists in the most important study ever done on this are now saying that asymptomatic transmission does not occur with COVID. That's the best science we have on that right now. And
right.
so
and
what
as you
we're
said,
what you would be doing
that was
with
actually
vaccine,
just published.
Yeah, it was published this morning. And what they were, so I have not read it all the way through, so excuse me if I got something wrong, but that's my kind of understanding from reading the abstract and glancing through the paper. But what could happen is that the vaccine could actually make things much worse, these vaccines, if they do not prevent transmissibility. And the weird thing about this, Ben, is that nobody from the press is asking the one question that counts. Do these vaccines prevent transmission? And if they don't, do they turn us all into asymptomatic carriers? And how does that work? And none of those questions are being asked. The press is focused on these big headlines that it's 95% effective, and nobody's saying against what? Against mild symptoms. And they're not saying, does it actually stop you from spreading the disease? And if it doesn't do that, then what's the point? What is the point?
Well, that becomes the big question, is what is the point? I want to ask you, though, about the fact that you've been so heavily censored on social media and your ability to speak, and primarily to question, because that's what I see that comes from your social feeds more than anything else, are serious questions. You just said the media won't ask the right questions. You've attempted to ask questions, but your voice has been silenced on these issues. It's not just about saying, well, no one cares what you have to say. It almost seems as if too many people maybe care about what you have to say, therefore they're not allowed to hear you. Can you just touch on that briefly for us? I mean, what has it been like for you for the last few weeks and months since essentially your social media has been shadow banned?
Well, it's frustrating. I mean, we've been censored for 15 years in the mainstream media, which, as you know, is Pharma controlled. But we were able to talk pretty freely on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter until 1919, when the WHO made the announcement. WHO, which of course is controlled by Bill Gates, made the announcement that vaccine hesitancy was one of the greatest threats, the global threats to public health. Immediately after that, Adam Schiff wrote a letter to all of who's the head of the Intelligence Committee, by the way, to the chair of the Intelligence Committee, to all to the social media CEOs, and then met with them. and ask them to begin censoring us. And, this has not happened before in American history. There has been, some kind of voluntary censorship, for example, during the McCarthy era, and there's been small outbreaks of censorship. But right now we have essentially the government using these social media platforms as surrogates to censor speech that challenges government policies. And so far, the courts have said that the First Amendment does not apply to those cases because these are private carriers. We've now brought a lawsuit against Facebook that says you're not a private carrier in this case because the government told you to do this, and you are coordinating the censorship, which they're open about, with WHO and with CDC. So you have CDC telling them what to censor and what not to censor. And then, the censorship, the fact-checking outfits that they're using to censor us are also, some of those are financed by government agencies. But we've said in this case, the First Amendment does apply in our case because they're actually censoring us as a surrogate of government action. And we'll see what happens to that lawsuit. I think it should win. The thing that people need to understand about the First Amendment, and I think Democrats have somehow forgotten this, which is shocking to me, being a Democrat, that the First Amendment, the founders put the First Amendment in the Constitution not to protect people who were trying to make, to speak popular words, or to protect speech that was convenient and that was agreeable and that was nice. They put it in the Constitution to protect inconvenient speech, unpopular speech. People, all of our rights are not to protect things that everybody agrees with, and particularly things that the government agrees with. Our rights are there to protect our capacity to express dissent against government policies, against pharmaceutical products, against, corporate power. And right now,
sure.
And that is really the foundation stone of American democracy, that the founders said, when we were in England, if the king didn't like what you said, he could jail you. He could shut you up. He could close down your newspaper. He could silence speech. He could stop people from assembling. He could stop you from petitioning the government. And those rights are being removed from the American people. And for some strange reason, there's no broad scale protest about this censorship. And that is, those two things are worrying. One, that the censorship is occurring. And two, that, the large amount of the American people and the Democratic Party are not objecting to it, but rather they're endorsing it.
Yeah, in many ways. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thank you so much for your time today and speaking out on the subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Before we go, we were supposed to be wrapping, but we're going to bring in one more guest because we have an important guest to get to. Dr. Rauner is with us now, and he is in Germany, and my understanding is actually filing a lawsuit. Correct me if I'm wrong, filing a lawsuit over many of the lockdowns that have occurred around the world. And you say it's because of these, I'm going to read it here, current geopolitical changes in the world are regarded as crimes against humanity. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, we filed that lawsuit today here in Germany. It's part of a larger strategy of lawsuits. We are in very close cooperation with Bobby Kennedy's CHD and his team of attorneys. But this is the first step, we believe, which I think will attack the cornerstone of the current crisis, which are the PCR tests, because we believe, after having listened to dozens of experts since July 10th here in Berlin in our Corona Investigative Committee, we believe that this is a staged pandemic. This is nothing to do with health, but everything to do with what Bobby Kennedy just talked about. They're very concrete dangers for democracy, in particular for free speech. So we believe that in order to make this house of cards collapse, we have to attack the PCR test, because in the meantime, we have learned from the WHO that the actual danger of this so-called pandemic is no worse than that of a common flu at 0.14% infection fatality rate. And we also know that there are no asymptomatic infections. So what is left is the PCR test. We know that from listening to our witnesses, we know that this particular now so-called Dresden PCR test, which supposedly tells you something about infections, does not tell you anything about infections, but rather it is being used as a tool to keep people in panic mode and not ask any questions about what they are supposed to do, like mask wearing requirements, social distancing, the lockdowns.
Okay, so let me get a little bit of clarification here on some things. So you said that the lawsuit was filed this morning. Who have you filed against?
This is a defamation lawsuit. Our plaintiff is Dr. Wolfgang Wodak. I don't know if you've heard about him. He's the person who more or less single-handedly stepped in 12 years ago when something very similar to what's happening now was about to happen, namely the swine flu. He's the one who was then in a position of political power. He was a member of the German parliament, and he was also a member of the Council of Europe. And he managed back then to stop things from getting any worse, even though it had gotten pretty bad at the time that he stepped in, because they were already vaccinating people with a hastily invented vaccine, which eventually did a lot of damage to, I think, 700 children here in Europe. They're now permanently disabled, suffering from narcolepsy. But he's the one who stopped this. And he did great work showing to the general population throughout the world that even then this so-called swine flu wasn't any worse, was just a mild flu eventually, and that's what we believe this is.
So he's the person you're suing, though?
No, he's the plaintiff, and we're suing a group of people. Yeah, we're suing a group of people, so-called fact checkers, which they're not, of course. They're manipulating the truth. They're being hired by the corporations that Bobby Kennedy just spoke about, by YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And we're suing them because, and this is clad in a defamation lawsuit. I'm doing this for reasons of burden of proof. This group of people is accusing Dr. Wodak of lying when he says that the PCR tests are unreliable and cannot tell you anything about infections. So we're doing two things. We're killing two birds with one stone. On the one hand, we're protecting Dr. Wodak, who is back in the picture now, and who's visible now for the general public, because, as I said, he's the one who did a great job 12 years ago, unmasking, so to speak, the swine flu. And at the same time, we're attacking the people who are behind this staged pandemic by attacking the PCR tests.
So when you say that you're attacking the PCR tests, what you're saying is you're doing that through a defamation lawsuit, if I'm understanding this correctly, saying Dr. Wodak is being attacked on social media or censored or defamed on social media because of statements he's making about the PCR tests. Therefore, we are suing for defamation in order to force those fact checkers to present their evidence as to why these statements that he has made about PCR tests are untrue. Do I have that correct?
Precisely. And you even got the burden of proof correct, because it's up to them to prove that he's lying. But the complaint that we've written is very well stocked with lots of evidence already, testimony and expert testimony and publications by experts in scientific journals, including Professor Kemmerer, who is a biologist and immunologist at the University of Würzburg here in Germany, including Dr. Mike Yeadon. You may have heard of him. He's a former vice president of Pfizer. And I think he was, for 16 years, he was their chief science officer. But there's others as well. So this is not something to be taken lightly. And I think the other side will know this once they read this.
I think what's interesting, because obviously, just to be clear here as a disclaimer, I have no evidence that PCR tests don't work. I have no evidence that they're flawed. Having said that, this strategy is very interesting to me because of the fact that the fact checkers, let's be clear about this, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in the UK or here in the United States, right, or Australia, the fact checkers themselves never seem to present evidence as to any of the reasons why information is removed or censored, taken down, thrown down the memory hole. That burden has never been placed on them legally to say, we have proof that the person here is lying. They simply label you as someone who is untruthful or spreading misinformation. So the fact that they would be required to then come forward and present evidence that proves one thing or another, do you believe that you are setting a precedent by doing this that can be followed, almost a blueprint that could be followed in other countries as well?
Excellent. You got it. You hit it right on the spot. That's precisely what we're doing. That's why this is going to be a precedent. This is one of many complaints we're going to file here in Germany and throughout Europe through the other law firms in all the German-speaking countries, Australia, Switzerland. Austria, Switzerland, but also the other countries, lawyers who we cooperate with. But this same complaint is going to be used, or a large part of it is also going to be used by our American and Canadian colleagues, because in the meantime, everybody agrees, all the lawyers who have kind of dug into this, all of them agree that the PCR test is the cornerstone of this entire hoax.
And again, is there any evidence that you can provide today that shows the PCR tests don't work?
Yeah, there's no scientists in this entire world who will claim that a PCR test can detect infections. PCR tests are not designed for diagnostic purposes. They're not admitted for diagnostic purposes. I've seen all the videos by the inventor of the PCR. A PCR test is a great tool. It makes things visible to the human eyes which are otherwise not visible, by amplifying it, by making those molecules that you take with these swabs larger, so that eventually you can see what this is all about. But they are not in any way capable of telling you anything about infections, in particular not when these PCR tests are set at more than 25 cycles. Everybody agrees, because cycles of amplification, that is. Everybody agrees, including the New York Times, which is part of the mainstream media, which, again, as Bobby Kennedy just alluded to, is apart from investing their money in the pharmaceutical and tech industry, they've also, the other side, I'm calling them, they've also invested much of their money in the mainstream media. But even the New York Times, in an article that was published in August of this year, agrees that anything beyond 35 cycles is completely and utterly unscientific and completely useless. Now, the tests we're talking about, the infamous Drosten test, which is what the so-called Professor Drosten here from Charité University in Berlin invented in order to show the world that by using these tests, you can see infections, you can detect infections. This test was used worldwide because it was pushed by the WHO as a sort of gold standard to find out about how many infections there are with COVID-19.
Fascinating stuff. Dr. Rauner Fuellmich, thank you so much for taking the time today. And personally, I wish you great luck in your lawsuit against those tech companies and their censorship. I think it's needed badly, not just in Germany, but worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you guys for tuning into the podcast today. I hope that we have helped to shed some light on what's going on, again, with the coronavirus, with the issue of vaccines and masks and of shutdowns, whether they be personal shutdowns or social shutdowns or economic shutdowns, because all of it, as I said, is affecting all of us worldwide. We will continue to hold those who are in power accountable, and we will continue to dig in on this issue. You can find the very latest, of course, always at RT.com. I'm Ben Swann. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.